Welcome to Archives of Humanity. I am Professor Adrian Lockwell. And this is not, in any serious sense, a story about a quiet library lovingly preserved in cultural memory. It is a story about power learning to think. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad is usually remembered as a sanctuary of learning, a noble refuge for books, astronomers, physicians, philosophers, and translators. That memory survives because part of it is true. But truth becomes misleading when it is softened. The Beit al-Hikmah did not matter simply because it stored knowledge. It mattered because a ruling dynasty discovered that knowledge could be organized, funded, translated, disciplined, and deployed as an instrument of rule. Translation became strategy. Science became administration. Philosophy became legitimacy. A library, in other words, began to behave like an arsenal. That is the paradox at the heart of this episode. Why would a dynasty born from revolution, bloodshed, and civil war spend enormous treasure on manuscripts, translators, astronomers, physicians, and mathematicians? Why would the victors of the Abbasid Revolution of AD 750, a regime forged in a violence of overthrow, turn with such intensity toward Greek thought, Persian statecraft, Indian calculation, astronomy, medicine, and logic? Why would rulers who had already seized an empire then begin a second conquest, this time over language, memory, and useful truth? Because force can take a throne, but force alone cannot make a throne durable. An empire spread across regions, peoples, legal traditions, tax systems, trade routes, and rival elites cannot survive on victory speeches and cavalry charges. It must count, compare, forecast, persuade, and administer. It must regulate calendars, survey land, calculate revenue, judge disputes, heal bodies, advise armies, navigate distance, and present itself as more than merely successful in war. It must appear rightful. It must appear competent. It must appear favored by history, by intellect, and if possible, by God. Under those conditions, knowledge stops being decorative. It becomes infrastructure. It becomes a tool for governing complexity. It becomes a language through which a regime explains why it deserves to rule. And once that happens, the patronage of scholars is no longer an act of cultural generosity alone. It is statecraft. This is why Baghdad matters. Founded in AD 762, Baghdad was not merely a capital in the ceremonial sense. It was a strategic capital, a city positioned to concentrate administration, commerce, and political authority under Abbasid control. From there, the rulers of the new dynasty could do more than govern territory. They could attempt something far more ambitious, to make Baghdad the place where authority over the empire and authority over knowledge reinforced one another. That is the first thesis of this investigation. Baghdad's knowledge project was never just about admiration for old books. It was about legitimacy after violent regime change. It was about administration on an imperial scale. It was about prestige in a world of rivals. It was about competition with inherited models of rule. It was about ideological authority. The Abbasids needed more than swords and slogans. They needed systems. They needed a language of power that looked universal rather than merely dynastic. And so the translation of texts into Arabic was not just a refined intellectual hobby taking place above politics. It was acquisition. It was selection. It was adaptation. It was the attempt to gather the working knowledge of multiple civilizations and absorb it into the operating language of empire. Arabic could then carry law, science, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, administration, and argument across an immense political world. What looked, from a distance, like scholarship also functioned as consolidation. Books helped rulers govern. Astronomers helped rulers organize time. Physicians helped courts manage health, patronage, and public credibility. Mathematicians helped transform land, distance, and taxation into calculable facts. Philosophical prestige helped the Abbasid state suggest that Baghdad was not simply the center of a successful regime, but the center of civilization itself. There was, moreover, nothing passive about this ambition. The Abbasid order emerged into a world of constant comparison. There were rival elites to outmaneuver, provinces to integrate, religious authority to negotiate, older Persian traditions of administration to inherit and surpass, and the prestige of the classical past to appropriate rather than merely admire. There was also Byzantium, not only as a military adversary on the frontier, but as a civilizational competitor in the broader struggle over who represented order, refinement, and universal authority. In that environment, collecting knowledge was not preservation alone. It was geopolitical positioning. But the story does not end with triumph. It carries a second thesis, and it is darker. The House of Wisdom was not simply lost in one apocalyptic instant when the Mongols sacked Baghdad in AD 1258. That catastrophe was real, and its symbolic power has shaped memory ever since. But institutions of learning rarely die in a single blow unless deeper weakness has already set in. They are usually eroded first by political fragmentation, unstable patronage, fiscal strain, ideological conflict, and the slow unraveling of the bond between knowledge and authority. The famous destruction becomes unforgettable because decay had already been at work. That correction matters because it changes the entire meaning of the House of Wisdom. This is not merely a tragic tale of enlightened brilliance extinguished by outside violence. It is an inquiry into how states build intellectual ecosystems, how they use them, how they overreach through them, and why those ecosystems become fragile when too much depends on the favor of power. The same court that can finance inquiry can also try to command belief. The same throne that elevates reason can demand submission from it. That tension is where the real drama begins. So the purpose here is not to repeat nostalgia. It is to strip away the romantic haze and examine the House of Wisdom as a deliberate imperial project. Not a museum piece. Not merely a lost paradise of manuscripts. But a political experiment in turning knowledge into authority, and authority into permanence. The rulers of Baghdad were not preserving the past for its own sake. They were trying to command reality more effectively than their rivals. And once that becomes clear, the first question is no longer what books sat on the shelves. The first question is what kind of empire needed those books badly enough to hunt them, translate them, fund them, and build institutions around them. To answer that, the lens now widens from the library to the revolution that made such a project necessary, and from the romance of scholarship to the hard geometry of the Abbasid state. Empires that expand faster than their institutions eventually begin searching for a new advantage. Not merely more soldiers, not merely more taxes, but better ways to measure, organize, and command reality itself. That was the pressure facing the Abbasids. They are often remembered through the glow of later intellectual achievement, but their story begins in political instability. Knowledge became valuable because power had become difficult. Before AD 750, the Umayyad Caliphate had built one of the largest states of the age. Its reach was astonishing. Yet scale concealed vulnerability. The dynasty still rested heavily on Arab elite dominance at the very moment its territories were becoming more varied in language, ethnicity, economy, and administrative complexity. Non-Arab converts to Islam, especially the Moali in the eastern provinces, often found that entry into the faith did not automatically mean entry into full social and political equality. Resentment gathered force where status, taxation, and access to power seemed unevenly distributed. What looked like imperial unity from a distance contained regional grievance up close. That tension mattered most in Khorasan. This was no peripheral afterthought. Khorasan was a military reservoir, a recruiting ground, a frontier of movement, and a zone where Arab settlers, Iranian populations, ambitious commanders, and imperial expectations collided. It produced the men and networks that could make or break dynasties. In strategic terms, Khorasan was where the promises of the caliphate were tested against provincial reality. When the gap grew too wide, rebellion became more than protest. It became an alternative center of power. The Abbasid Revolution of AD 750 emerged from precisely that fracture. It was not simply a palace coup with a new banner. It was a transfer of power sold as moral correction, broader inclusion, and restored legitimacy. The Abbasids drew strength from Eastern support, especially from Khurasani forces, and wrapped their cause in a political theology more expansive than Umayyad dynastic confidence. They did not present themselves as one ruling clan replacing another in an endless sequence of strongmen. They presented themselves as the house that could better represent the community, better honor sacred authority, and better govern a diverse empire. That claim was powerful, but it was also dangerous. A regime born through revolution inherits suspicion along with victory. The Abbasids had overthrown a ruling house by mobilizing discontent. That meant they could never rely on bloodline rhetoric alone. They needed to persuade elites, soldiers, jurists, merchants, and provincial populations that their rule was not merely successful, but rightful. They had to appear universal rather than factional, learned rather than crude, just rather than predatory, and divinely favored rather than temporarily lucky. In other words, they needed legitimacy that could survive the memory of civil war. This is where the search for knowledge begins to make political sense. Not as ornament. Not as a noble hobby of enlightened princes. As infrastructure for authority. When al-Mansur founded Baghdad in AD 762, the decision was strategic to the core. He was not choosing a picturesque capital. He was building a center from which an immense imperial web could be managed. Baghdad stood near major river routes and trade arteries, closer to Persian administrative traditions than the old Umayyad center in Syria, and better positioned to supervise the traffic of goods, officials, correspondence, and intelligence moving across the empire. This was centralization in stone. Its later reputation as a great crossroads did not arise from some magical cosmopolitan spirit descending upon the city. Baghdad became open because the state needed it to be useful. Power pulled talent inward. Merchants arrived because commerce followed security and opportunity. Scribes arrived because records had to be kept. Envoys arrived because diplomacy required a stage worthy of empire. Scholars, physicians, translators, and astronomers arrived because a regime trying to govern scale could not afford intellectual isolation. Mediterranean exchanges fed one side of the city's life. Iranian administrative habits fed another. Central Asian military and commercial currents entered from the east. Indian mathematical and astronomical traditions moved through the same circuits that carried textiles, silver, and official correspondence. Where trade moved, information moved with it. And information was becoming a strategic resource. The Abbasid state faced administrative problems that brute force could not solve. Taxation required land assessment, accounting, and reliable categories of revenue. Law demanded precision in inheritance, contracts, and judicial reasoning. Calendars were not trivial matters in a religious empire. Ritual timekeeping shaped fasting, prayer, and public authority, while administrative calendars shaped taxation, agriculture, and official coordination. Surveying mattered for irrigation and agricultural yield. Medicine mattered because court health, army endurance, and urban confidence all rested on practical expertise. Navigation mattered across rivers, deserts, and maritime trade routes. The empire needed systems, and systems required disciplined knowledge. That is why mathematics, geography, astronomy, and medicine acquired political weight. Mathematics was the grammar of administration. Geography was intelligence about roads, provinces, borders, and vulnerabilities. Astronomy helped regulate calendars, orient ritual, and support prestige through calculated mastery of the heavens. Even astrology, however later ages judged it, functioned within the political psychology of rule, where signs, timing, and celestial order could reinforce sovereign confidence. A caliph who governed through accurate reckoning appeared more than strong. He appeared ordered, almost providential. The Byzantine frontier sharpened this appetite further. Constantinople was both enemy and rival model. War with Byzantium imposed constant military pressure, but the frontier was not a sealed wall. Diplomacy, embassies, truces, prisoner exchanges, and prestige competition created channels through which texts, techniques, and reputations could travel. The Abbasids were confronting another great civilization that also claimed refinement, inheritance, and universal significance. To compete with Byzantium was to compete not only over territory, but over who represented the highest form of political order. In that setting, older learning from the classical world, including the legacy of 4th century BC thinkers such as Aristotle and the mathematical tradition associated with figures like Euclid, mattered because it could be put to use. Antiquity was not a relic. It was a reservoir. One development made the whole project vastly more practical, the spread of papermaking into the Abbasid sphere after the mid-8th century AD. This was a quiet revolution with enormous consequences. Paper lowered the cost of writing, expanded the volume of record-keeping, accelerated correspondence, multiplied copies, and strengthened bureaucratic memory. States do not rule large territories by inspiration alone. They rule through archives, reports, registers, calculations, and reproducible texts. Paper gave the empire a larger memory and a faster administrative nervous system. So the logic becomes clear. The Abbasids did not turn toward learning because they were sentimental collectors of beautiful books. They turned toward it because an empire born from revolution and ruling vast diversity needed tools of coordination, persuasion, and control. It needed physicians, jurists, translators, astronomers, secretaries, and mathematicians. It needed ways to gather useful truth, standardize it, and circulate it through the machinery of rule. Once that realization took hold, information itself was no longer a luxury of civilization. It was becoming an asset of state power, and the next stage would depend on the people and institutions capable of turning that insight into a working imperial system. Once information began to matter as much as territory, the Abbasids faced a harder problem than conquest. Winning power is one achievement. Building a machine that can gather, test, store, and deploy knowledge across an empire is another. On that second task, Baghdad became extraordinary. The first correction must come early, because later memory often simplifies what was actually built. Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was real, but it should not be pictured too casually as a modern university, nor even too neatly as a single academy in the later sense. Those labels are tempting, and they are often useful shortcuts, but they smuggle in anachronisms. What existed in Abbasid Baghdad was more fluid and, in strategic terms, more impressive: a court-connected library, a translation bureau, an archive, a scholarly network, and a patronage ecosystem tied to the needs of rule. It was not merely a place. It was an apparatus. That distinction changes the entire story. The House of Wisdom was not a monument to vague admiration for learning. It was part of a larger imperial method. The Abbasids inherited a world full of scattered intellectual capital, then began turning that scattered inheritance into organized advantage. They did not stumble into cosmopolitan brilliance. They funded it, disciplined it, and gave it purpose. The foundations of that effort long predated Abbasid rule. Syriac Christian scholars had already served for generations as crucial intermediaries in the transmission of Greek medicine, philosophy, and science through the late antique Near East. Their bilingual and often trilingual expertise made them indispensable. They did not simply carry texts from one shelf to another, they preserved chains of interpretation, technical vocabulary, and habits of commentary. Without those intermediaries, much of the later Arabic translation movement would have lacked both personnel and method. Alongside that inheritance stood Persian administrative knowledge, equally important and often less romanticized. Empires are not held together by elegant ideas alone. They survive through taxation, records, court protocol, provincial communication, legal procedure, and the management of distance. Persian traditions offered the Abbasids experience in exactly those arts. This was not ornamental influence. It was governing intelligence. Then there was the medical and scholarly legacy associated with Jundashaper. Here, precision matters. Jundashaper should not be described as a simple blueprint later copied wholesale into Baghdad. The evidence does not support such a crude line of descent. But it does stand as an important precedent, a place linked in historical memory with elite patronage, medicine, and the meeting of different learned traditions. The Abbasids did not create cross-cultural scholarship from nothing. They inherited channels, precedents, and skilled communities, then expanded them under far greater political and financial weight. That is where patronage becomes decisive. Under early Abbasid rulers, including Harun al-Rashid, and under elite households such as the Barmakids, scholarship was drawn into the orbit of power through deliberate investment. Books had to be acquired. Translators had to be paid. Physicians had to be retained. Secretaries, copyists, scholars, and court intellectuals all required material support. Knowledge does not become infrastructure until someone finances the labor behind it. The Barmakids are especially revealing. They were not simply refined aristocrats surrounding the caliph with elegance. They were major political operators whose patronage shaped access, prestige, and competence at the center of the caliphate. In their world, supporting translators and scholars was not separate from power. It was one of the ways power announced its sophistication, strengthened its networks, and sharpened its administrative capacity. What the Abbasid court chose to translate reveals what the Abbasid court needed. This was not antiquarian collecting. Old books were not valued merely because they were old. Medicine mattered because courts, armies, and urban populations depended on physicians who could diagnose, preserve, and intervene. Astrology and astronomy mattered because rulers sought calendars, ritual timing, celestial calculation, and a language through which political destiny could be narrated. Mathematics mattered for inheritance law, taxation, surveying, accounting, and commercial order. Geography mattered for ruling a connected but uneven imperial space. Mechanics mattered for practical ingenuity and elite display. Political and philosophical works mattered because every revolutionary dynasty eventually confronts the same severe question: on what basis can authority claim permanence after violence brings it to power? Translation, in that sense, was where empires decided what counted as useful truth. Useful truth, however, does not expand by admiration alone. It expands through materials, labor, and circulation. The spread of paper through the Abbasid world changed the economics of intellectual life. Manuscript culture remained labor-intensive, but paper made copying faster, cheaper, and more scalable than older materials allowed. That single logistical shift widened the state's memory. Around that material base grew the human machinery: scribes, copyists, booksellers, librarians, secretaries, and bilingual scholars capable of moving between Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Arabic. A text translated once could now travel. It could be recopied, corrected, taught, debated, and folded into wider scholarly exchange. Astronomical tables could move from scholarly calculation into courtly use. Medical compilations could circulate among physicians. Administrative knowledge could leave the isolated possession of a few specialists and become reproducible. This is why translation should never be mistaken for passive transfer. It was not a matter of taking a text in one language and producing a neutral duplicate in another. Translators had to compare variant manuscripts, identify corrupt passages, choose among competing terms, invent Arabic vocabulary where exact equivalents did not exist, and decide how far adaptation should go. Some works were abridged. Some were expanded. Some were clarified through commentary. Some were ignored because they were judged unreliable, redundant, or politically irrelevant. Translation was selection under pressure. That pressure was intellectual, but never only intellectual. The Abbasids were not assembling a museum of civilizations. They were building a usable archive of power. A ruling house born from revolution needed more than armies and slogans. It needed medicine that worked, calculations that held, records that endured, and a language in which many traditions could be reordered under Abbasid authority. This also elevated the status of figures too often treated as background personnel. Translators were strategic actors. A translator could determine which medical doctrine entered circulation, which philosophical terminology became standard in Arabic, and which inherited text achieved authority. Copyists preserved continuity. Patrons decided what deserved support. Secretaries decided what merited administrative memory. Scholars decided what could be trusted. Piece by piece, the empire built not only a library of texts, but a hierarchy of credibility. And once Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Indian materials were reorganized into Arabic, something larger happened. Knowledge that had existed in separate linguistic worlds could now be compared within a common intellectual medium. Baghdad was not simply receiving wisdom. It was processing it, ranking it, and preparing it for use in governance, law, medicine, astronomy, and prestige. The myth of isolated genius hides the deeper reality. Great learning often emerges when institutions learn how to gather talent, pay for patience, and turn scholarship into durable capacity. In Baghdad, that capacity was now taking recognizable form. The system had been assembled. What remained was for a generation of ambitious rulers, translators, mathematicians, and scientific patrons to push it toward its boldest expression. The apparatus was now in place, but institutions do not move history on their own. They require operators, rulers who can convert patronage into policy, scholars who can convert manuscripts into usable systems, and elites who understand that prestige can be as valuable as force. In Baghdad, learning was not a decorative side project of prosperity. It was organized under the pressure of rule. No figure brings that pressure into clearer focus than Al-Ma'mun. He did not inherit a calm and settled throne. He emerged from the Abbasid civil war against his brother Al-Amin, a brutal contest that revealed how quickly universal claims could collapse into faction, siege, and regional power politics. His victory depended heavily on Khurasani support, and that fact mattered far beyond the battlefield. Khorasan had long been one of the deepest reservoirs of Abbasid military energy and political legitimacy. It had helped lift the dynasty to power in AD 750, and under Al-Ma'mun it again proved that the caliphate did not rest on ceremony alone. It rested on coalitions, on memory, and on the ability to persuade a fractured empire that one center still possessed the right to define order. That is why Al-Ma'mun's reputation for intellectual ambition cannot be separated from the trauma of civil war. A ruler who had seen the empire nearly consume itself needed more than victory. He needed a theory of victory. He needed to present Abbasid rule as rational, universal, and superior to mere dynastic habit. Under him, Bayt al-Hikmah expanded not as a cultural luxury after chaos, but as part of a larger display of imperial confidence. Baghdad would not simply command armies and taxes. It would claim authority over truth itself, over calculation, translation, astronomy, medicine, and the disciplined ordering of inherited knowledge. This is where the celebrated names of the period must be understood not as isolated geniuses, but as strategic specialists inside a political machine. Hunayn ibn Ishaq is a perfect example. He is often remembered as a great translator of medicine and philosophy, yet that phrase can sound far too gentle for what he actually did. Hunayn did not merely transfer words from Greek into Syriac or Arabic. He gathered manuscripts from different places, compared variant copies, identified corrupt passages, weighed terminology, and produced versions of texts that physicians and scholars could trust. Galen was not useful to an empire if transmitted carelessly. Aristotle was not useful if rendered into confusion. In a world where knowledge traveled through fragile copies, textual reliability was a form of infrastructure. Hunayn's labor resembles scholarship, but its strategic meaning is logistical. He helped turn a scattered inheritance into a stable archive that the Abbasid world could actually use. Thabit ibn Qurra reveals the next stage of the process. He too belonged to the world of translation, but Baghdad's ambition was never satisfied with preservation alone. Thabit worked across mathematics, astronomy, and mechanics in ways that show how translation and original inquiry became intertwined. Euclid and Ptolemy entered Arabic not as museum pieces, but as living participants in a new intellectual arena. Once translated, they could be corrected, extended, criticized, and placed into fresh problems. In Thabit, the empire's appetite for acquisition becomes something more ambitious: production. The point was no longer simply to possess the legacy of earlier civilizations. It was to force that legacy into new service. Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi stands at that same frontier, and perhaps even more clearly. He symbolizes the moment when imported knowledge ceased to be foreign material and became new science in Arabic. Drawing on Greek geometry, Indian mathematics and astronomy, and the administrative needs of the Abbasid state, al-Khwarizmi helped generate work that mattered in mathematics, geography, and astronomical tables. This was not imitation dressed in courtly elegance. It was synthesis under administrative pressure. Calculation mattered because empires count land, revenue, inheritance shares, distances, calendars, and obligations. Geography mattered because power depends on routes, regions, and measurable space. Astronomical tables mattered because ritual timekeeping, calendrical coordination, and prestige all converged there. In al-Khwarizmi, knowledge became governable, and therefore politically consequential. Then there were the Banu Musa brothers, whose importance lies in the fact that they were not easy to classify. They were patrons, investigators, and political actors at once. Wealthy and deeply embedded in Abbasid elite networks, they financed translations, sponsored scholars, commissioned books and instruments, and pursued scientific inquiry themselves. That mixture is revealing. It shows that Baghdad's knowledge project did not depend on a single enlightened caliph issuing commands from above. It relied on a broader aristocracy of money, access, competition, and cultivated ambition. The Banu Musa demonstrate a hard truth about intellectual flourishing: it often advances not because elites become virtuous, but because they discover that learning can enhance status, influence, and strategic relevance. The manuscripts themselves moved through equally political channels. Later memory sometimes simplifies the story into a tidy image of caliphs requesting ancient books from Byzantium and receiving them like ceremonial tribute. Some exchanges did happen through embassies and elite diplomacy, and the prestige rivalry with Byzantium certainly mattered. Constantinople was a military adversary, but it was also a rival claimant to civilizational authority. To acquire portions of the Greek corpus was therefore not only useful, it was symbolically charged. Yet the real traffic in knowledge was more complex than treaty legends suggest. Manuscripts were sought through scholarly contacts, private collections, older centers of learning, diplomatic openings, and opportunistic acquisition. Book hunting was not a fairy tale of cultural openness. It was a serious operation shaped by power, access, and competition. What made Baghdad exceptional was not simply that it collected texts from many worlds. It was what happened after collection. Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Indian materials were reorganized into Arabic, the administrative and intellectual lingua franca of the Abbasid realm. That transformation was decisive. It allowed Galen, Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Indian astronomy to enter a common discursive arena, where methods could be compared, adapted, and made legible to officials, physicians, astronomers, and scholars across the empire. Arabic did not passively preserve knowledge. It integrated it. It ranked it. It made it portable across institutions of rule. So these figures were never merely lovers of books. Al-Ma'mun, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, Thabit ibn Qurra, Al-Khwarizmi, and the Banu Musa occupied different positions inside one larger experiment, the attempt to fuse intellectual prestige with imperial authority. Baghdad was building more than a library and more than a scholarly circle. It was constructing a system meant to prove that the dynasty could gather the world's knowledge, refine it, and speak with unmatched authority through it. And that achievement carried within it the next danger. Once a ruler begins to believe that patronage over knowledge can become sovereignty over belief, the line between inquiry and command grows perilously thin. By the time Al-Ma'mun stood at the height of Abbasid power, the translation movement had matured into something larger than patronage. It had become a claim about rule itself. Knowledge was no longer merely being collected, copied, and refined. It was being arranged as evidence that the caliphate could do more than govern cities and armies. It could define order. Under Al-Ma'mun, astronomy, mathematics, geography, and philosophy received state support because they served practical needs, but also because they projected an image of civilizational command. A dynasty that had come to power through revolution and survived civil war wanted more than obedience. It wanted intellectual supremacy. This was the boldest phase of the Abbasid experiment. Astronomical work mattered for calendars, ritual timekeeping, navigation, and astrology, but it also mattered for prestige. More accurate tables suggested a court capable of mastering regularity itself. Geographical inquiry mattered for taxation, routes, frontiers, and administration, yet it also carried theatrical force. Reports of measurements of the Earth, efforts to improve maps, and attempts to describe the inhabited world with greater precision all sent the same message. Baghdad was not simply rich. It was organized. It was calculating. It was a capital that sought to appear equal to the cosmos it claimed to interpret. That is why the scientific ambition of Al-Ma'mun's reign cannot be reduced to scholarly curiosity alone. The Caliph's circle supported inquiry because calculated knowledge enhanced the dignity of rule. An observatory was not just a workshop. A revised astronomical table was not just a technical document. A geographical survey was not just information. These were performances of competence on an imperial stage. They announced that the Abbasid state had absorbed materials from Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Indian traditions and converted them into Arabic as the language of command. Borrowed learning was being recast as sovereign knowledge. For a moment, the synthesis looked formidable. The court could present itself as the meeting point of revelation, administration, and disciplined reasoning. That gave Al-Ma'mun an advantage no ordinary conqueror possessed. Many empires seized territory. Fewer attempt to claim the right to explain how truth itself should be organized. Here lay the hidden temptation. Once a ruler has made learning part of state prestige, the boundary between sponsoring inquiry and directing belief begins to thin. Al-Ma'mun's political experience made that temptation even stronger. He was not a detached lover of ideas reigning in calm conditions. He was a victor of a brutal civil war against his brother Al-Amin, a ruler who knew how quickly caliphal authority could fracture when provinces, military forces, and rival elites chose sides. After such a crisis, centralization could not stop at armies and revenue. The logic of the age pushed towards something more ambitious. If legitimacy was fragile, then the throne might seek to dominate the terms on which legitimacy itself was discussed. That logic culminated in the Mina, beginning in AD 833. Later memory often shrinks the Mina into a technical argument over whether the Quran was created. But politically, it was a struggle over sovereignty. The doctrinal question mattered because it touched a deeper issue: who had the authority to define correct belief, and who possessed the final word in disputes over revelation and reason. By imposing doctrinal tests, Al-Ma'mun was not merely entering theology. He was asserting that the caliph could examine scholars, judge their orthodoxy, and place the court above rival centers of learned authority. This is the decisive collision at the heart of Baghdad's brilliance. The same regime that financed inquiry also tried to monopolize legitimate inquiry. The same state that elevated reason sought to decide which forms of reason would be permissible. In other words, support for knowledge was genuine, but it was never politically innocent. The court wanted truth, but truth on terms that stabilized the throne. Strategically, the move was understandable. Independent jurists, traditionalist scholars, and religious communities carried a form of influence the palace could not easily absorb. They could shape public legitimacy without commanding soldiers. For a ruler determined to restore confidence after civil war, that was dangerous. A caliph might win the battlefield and still lose the moral architecture of the empire. The Mina was an attempt to close that gap. It sought to make doctrine legible to power, and power authoritative in doctrine. But this was also the great blunder. Intellectual authority is not a fortress that can be occupied by decree. Coercion may compel compliance, yet it rarely generates enduring trust. Worse still, when state-backed learning is fused to doctrinal pressure, the prestige of scholarship itself begins to corrode. What had looked like a search for ordered truth can suddenly appear to be court ideology wearing the language of reason. Nuance is essential here. The scholars working in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and translation were not one political faction. Rational inquiry was not identical with coercive theology. Scientific and philosophical work had real value independent of the caliph's doctrinal agenda. But public memory does not always preserve such distinctions. Once the throne linked intellectual authority to compel dissent, opponents could portray state-associated rationalism as arrogance backed by force. The reputational damage outlived the policy itself. Resistance gave that damage a human face. Traditionalist scholars refused to concede that the caliph could become the final examiner of belief. Ahmad ibn Hanbal would emerge as the most famous symbol of that resistance, not because he represented hostility to all learning, but because he stood against the submission of religious authority to imperial command. That distinction matters enormously. This was not a childish struggle between reason and ignorance. It was a contest over who may speak for truth when the state enters the realm of conscience. The shockwaves were immediate, and they were larger than the Mina's formal machinery. Once learning became visibly entangled with coercion, every court-sponsored intellectual project became more vulnerable to politics. What one caliph praised as enlightened, another could condemn as dangerous. What the palace elevated, the palace could expose. Knowledge tied too tightly to the throne became hostage to succession, faction, and reversal. That reversal came soon enough. Later caliphs, especially al-Mutawakkil in the mid-9th century AD, moved away from the Mina and effectively acknowledged the limits of caliphal control over learned authority. But by then, the deeper lesson had already been written into Abbasid political culture. Patronage could become pressure. Inquiry could become doctrine. And the House of Wisdom, together with the wider scholarly world around it, had reached its most dazzling and most perilous summit at the same time. From this point forward, the central question changes. If a knowledge empire rises through confidence, funding, and institutional will, what remains when confidence weakens, patronage shifts, and the political center can no longer hold its monopoly on prestige? The crisis did not end when the Inquisition ended. It merely changed form. What had been a dramatic confrontation under Al-Ma'mun and his successors now became a quieter, more revealing story about the limits of power itself. When al-Mutawakkil brought the Mina to an end in the mid-9th century AD, the decision was not just a theological correction. It was an admission. The caliphate had discovered that commanding armies and taxes was not the same as commanding learned authority. A throne could sponsor scholars, elevate judges, finance observatories, and fill libraries, but it could not indefinitely force the most sensitive questions of truth into permanent obedience. Once the state tried to monopolize orthodoxy through coercion, it exposed the boundary it could not cross without damage to its own prestige. That is the first correction history demands. The weakening of Baghdad's intellectual supremacy did not begin with foreign invasion. It began when the Abbasid court learned that knowledge tied too tightly to political will becomes unstable. Al-Mutawakkil's reversal showed that the caliph could withdraw pressure, but he could not restore the old innocence of state-sponsored reason. The bond between scholarship and court power had been tested under extreme strain, and everyone now understood its risks. From that point forward, caliphal patronage still mattered, but it no longer carried the same uncontested claim to define the terms of legitimate thought. From there, the larger erosion set in. The Abbasids did not suddenly cease to be important, and Baghdad did not suddenly become empty. What changed was the political architecture that had once made the city the unrivaled clearinghouse of imperial knowledge. Provincial rulers accumulated greater autonomy. Military elites became more decisive in shaping succession and policy. Fiscal pressure tightened around the center. And once revenue became less secure, patronage itself became less concentrated. The labor that sustains a civilization's intellect is expensive. Translators need support. Copyists need materials. Teachers need students. Libraries require acquisition, storage, and trust. Scientific work demands time, instruments, and social prestige. When the state that once coordinated these things begins to fragment, knowledge does not vanish at once. It disperses. That is why decline is so often misunderstood. Popular memory searches for a single fatal blow because catastrophe is easy to narrate. Institutional decay is harder. Yet civilizations are rarely stripped of learning in one dramatic instant. They are weakened when the mechanisms that make learning reproducible begin to fail. Protected trade routes become less dependable. Archives become more vulnerable. Elite households change priorities. Endowments shrink or shift. Scholars migrate toward safer patrons. Public confidence in expertise becomes more contested. By the time chroniclers describe a final disaster, much of the deeper damage has already been done in budgets, appointments, loyalties, and habits of preservation. So the fading of Baghdad was, above all, a story of decentralization before destruction. Across the Islamic world, other centers of patronage rose as Abbasid central authority thinned. Intellectual life did not simply expire because one court lost its commanding position. It migrated, adapted, and found new institutional homes. Regional dynasties, urban elites, jurists, physicians, and scholarly families all participated in this reshaping. In one sense, this was a loss for Baghdad's monopoly. In another, it was proof of how successful the Abbasid model had been. The early caliphs had demonstrated that patronage of knowledge produced prestige, legitimacy, and administrative advantage. Other powers learned the lesson. The political markers of that change are unmistakable. In AD 945, the Buyids took Baghdad. The Abbasid caliph remained in place, but increasingly as a figure of ceremonial legitimacy under stronger hands. That mattered enormously. It meant the old vision of a caliphal capital directing both sovereignty and intellectual leadership had been fundamentally weakened. Then in AD 1055, the Seljuks entered Baghdad and imposed yet another political reality. Once again, the city remained important. Once again, learning continued. But the context had changed. Patronage no longer radiated from a single, confident imperial center. It operated through a more competitive and fragmented political order, where legitimacy, military force, and scholarly authority were being renegotiated across multiple courts and elites. As this happened, the ecology of learning also changed. The older court-centered translation culture did not simply disappear, but it ceased to be the dominant model through which intellectual authority was organized. Madrasas emerged as major institutions of instruction and prestige, supported by endowments, embedded in urban society, and linked to durable teaching lineages. This shift should not be reduced to a simplistic tale of one form of knowledge replacing another. It was not a clean break, and it was not the death of curiosity. It was a redistribution of emphasis. Law, theology, language, and commentary became increasingly central within new institutional settings. Learning moved away from depending so heavily on the fortunes of palace politics and toward networks that could, at least in some cases, outlast a single ruler's enthusiasm. This is why the famous memory of the House of Wisdom can mislead. It is tempting to jump from Al-Mamun's brilliance to the Mongol sack of Baghdad in AD 1258, as though an intact intellectual order survived untouched for centuries and was then annihilated in one apocalyptic stroke. The sack was real. It was materially destructive, politically devastating, and symbolically immense. Later memory lingered on the image of the Tigris darkened by ink from ruined books. Whether taken as literal report, literary embellishment, or civilizational metaphor, the image endured because it expressed genuine trauma. But analysis must resist the seduction of symbolism. The Mongols shattered Baghdad's remaining central prestige. They did not create from nothing the centuries of decentralization, institutional change, and fiscal erosion that made the blow so consequential. Nor did Arabic learning end in Baghdad. By AD 1258, the intellectual wealth generated in the Abbasid centuries had already traveled far beyond Iraq. In Al-Andalus, in Sicily, and later in Latin Christendom, Arabic became one of the great vehicles through which medicine, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and commentarial traditions moved across civilizations. Galenic medicine circulated through Arabic scholarship. Aristotle often arrived through Arabic commentators. Astronomical tables, algebraic methods, and geographic syntheses crossed frontiers because the Abbasid world had not merely preserved inherited knowledge. It had reorganized, debated, expanded, and translated it into a portable intellectual medium. The political center weakened, but the intellectual afterlife widened. And that brings the deeper lesson into focus. Libraries matter. Manuscripts matter. Cities matter. But the real fragility of knowledge lies elsewhere. Knowledge survives only when societies maintain the fiscal, political, and social mechanisms that keep it copied, argued over, taught, financed, and trusted. Civilizations do not usually lose learning in a single night. They lose the revenues that sustain institutions, the patronage that rewards difficult work, the structures that train successors, and the confidence that allows truth to retain authority even when power cannot fully control it. At that scale, Baghdad stops looking like a self-contained medieval tragedy. It begins to look like a recurring law of history. States rise by organizing intelligence. They flourish by rewarding expertise. And they begin to decay when they can no longer sustain the very systems of knowledge that once made rule possible. That is the wider pattern now coming into view. That is why the House of Wisdom cannot be left inside the soft glow of nostalgia. Its significance was never confined to the fact that Baghdad possessed books, or that learned men gathered near a powerful court. Many dynasties collected manuscripts. Many rulers praised learning when it improved their image. What made Baghdad historically decisive was something far more formidable. The Abbasid world recognized that knowledge could be organized, financed, translated, ranked, and deployed as an instrument of rule. The House of Wisdom mattered because it revealed, with unusual clarity, that ideas are not decorative. They are structural. They can steady a throne, sharpen administration, elevate a language, project prestige, and persuade a vast political order that its rulers stand at the center of truth itself. That is the central verdict. Baghdad did not simply admire learning. It converted learning into capacity. Translation became more than preservation, it became selection, filtration, and strategic adaptation. Scholarship became more than curiosity, it became governance. Astronomy helped regulate ritual life and imperial confidence. Mathematics served calculation, taxation, surveying, and coordination across immense distances. Medicine served courts, cities, institutions, and legitimacy. Philosophy and theology, once drawn close to the state, became entangled in a larger contest over who possessed the authority to define what counted as correct belief, correct reasoning, and correct order. In that sense, the House of Wisdom was not the opposite of empire. It was one of empire's most refined expressions. But the achievement cannot be separated from the warning. History is ruthless toward civilizations that celebrate brilliance while ignoring the conditions that make brilliance survivable. The same state that finances inquiry can begin to command belief. The same court that gathers exceptional minds can slowly reduce intellect to an instrument of legitimacy. The same patronage that makes a golden age possible can make that same golden age dangerously dependent on political weather. Once knowledge is tied too tightly to unstable power, it acquires a hidden weakness. It appears dazzling from a distance, yet it cannot easily defend itself when dynasties fracture, priorities shift, factions harden, or coercion poisons trust. That was not a side note in Baghdad's story. It was the trap built into the triumph. And that is the deeper tragedy. Not merely that books were lost, though they were. Not merely that institutions were damaged by violence, though they were. The deeper tragedy is that intellectual ecosystems are more fragile than monuments. Stone can endure neglect for centuries. Thought cannot. Thought must be copied, argued over, taught, funded, challenged, and trusted. A civilization does not preserve knowledge by praising it in ceremonial language. It preserves knowledge by building durable arrangements around it, political arrangements, fiscal arrangements, social arrangements, moral arrangements. When those arrangements weaken, libraries stop functioning as engines of power and become relics of memory. What vanishes first is not always information itself, but the living system that made information useful, credible, and renewable. That is why Baghdad still feels modern without needing to be forced into modern slogans. The technologies have changed. The scale has changed. The institutions have changed. But the tension remains hauntingly familiar. Societies still compete through research, through technical mastery, through the control of information, through the power to translate complexity into systems, and through the prestige that comes from appearing to speak authoritatively about reality. The contest is no longer confined to caliphs, courts, and manuscript hunters. Yet the underlying structure remains recognizable across centuries. Whoever organizes knowledge most effectively gains more than efficiency. That power gains narrative authority, the ability to define what counts as progress, what counts as expertise, what counts as truth, and which future appears inevitable. But modernity inherits the same temptation that shadowed Abbasid greatness. States praise inquiry when it strengthens them, and become uneasy when inquiry resists them. Institutions celebrate openness, then try to police interpretation. Power funds expertise, then pressures expertise to confirm its assumptions. It constructs systems of learning, then forgets that credibility cannot be commanded the way taxes can be collected or armies can be deployed. Baghdad's lesson is not a simple moral tale in which power corrupts knowledge in every case. The lesson is more severe, and more unsettling. Power needs knowledge, knowledge often needs power, and their alliance can produce extraordinary civilization while remaining permanently unstable. That is why the House of Wisdom still matters. Not as a ruined paradise. Not as a sentimental parable about books alone. Not as a decorative symbol of lost tolerance. It matters as a case study in one of history's oldest ambitions, the desire not merely to rule populations, but to rule the terms by which reality is interpreted. For a time, Baghdad came astonishingly close to that achievement. It assembled languages, inherited sciences, arguments, calculations, and rival traditions into a civilizational machine of immense confidence. It demonstrated what becomes possible when a state decides that intellect is a strategic resource. And it demonstrated, with equal force, how vulnerable that achievement becomes when truth is chained too tightly to patronage and power. So the final question is not whether Baghdad was brilliant. That is beyond dispute. The real question is harsher, and far more important: what kind of civilization can build institutions strong enough to cultivate knowledge, wealthy enough to sustain it, ambitious enough to value it, and restrained enough not to consume it? History offers no easy answer. It offers evidence. And Baghdad remains among the greatest pieces of evidence ever left behind. The House of Wisdom was not merely a treasure of the past. It was a revelation about the architecture of civilization itself, that empires rise not only on steel, tribute, and armies, but on archives, arguments, measurements, memory, and the fragile human decision to make truth durable. And when that decision fails, the loss is never only of books. It is the loss of a society's ability to remember how power once learned to think. If this history was worth following to the end, continue with the video on the end screen, leave one answer in the comments: can great knowledge ever remain fully independent from great power? And subscribe for more historical analysis that treats empires not as legends, but as systems.